Okay, we will now go over Chapter 10 on nutrition in fitness and sport. And I do look forward to talking about this topic because I have a background in sports nutrition and enjoy talking about nutrition as it relates to performance and health. So we know there are many benefits of physical activity. They can be separated by the benefits to our physical fitness. It helps with strengthening bones and joints, increasing muscle mass and strength, helping with sleep, with immune system function, flexibility, and balance. There's also a psychological or cognitive related benefits, reducing stress and improving self-image, preventing or reducing depression and anxiety, improving cognitive function. We also see benefits to reducing risk of chronic disease. We see it helps with reducing risk of colon, prostate, and or breast cancer, helping with improving cardiovascular function, improving blood lipid profile, reducing blood pressure, blood glucose regulation, aiding in weight loss or weight control. So there are a number of benefits of physical activity, different types of benefits. So it is definitely promoted as a part of our overall health and well-being. We have the physical activity guidelines as set in 2008. We have recommendations of at least 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise or less half of that amount, 75 minutes of vigorous, or a combination that would be equivalent of both moderate and vigorous intensity aerobic activity. The episodes of this structured exercise should be at least 10 minutes or longer and spread out throughout the week. So there are different ways of breaking up this amount of physical activity. However, it should be lasting at least 10 minutes for getting the aerobic benefit. Additional and more extensive health benefits could be established with more physical activity of 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise or 150 minutes per week of vigorous intensity. Aerobic activity may have a greater benefit. However, 80% of American adults fail to achieve these minimums, so there's definitely a lot of work that can be done in the US for promoting physical activity. It's also important to include resistance training or muscle strengthening activities involving major muscle groups of the upper and lower body 2 or more days per week, and it is recommended that those 2 days per week not be consecutive days, so that they would not be consecutive, or they would be alternating. Types of activity, so we have moderate and vigorous intensity. That's defined based on the RPE scale. That stands for ratings of perceived exertion. So the moderate intensity would be an RPE of 5 to 6 on the RPE scale. That would be brisk walking, swimming, dancing, cycling. Vigorous activity would be higher intensity, with the level being 7 to 8 on the RPE scale. So at this level of vigorous intensity exercise, you would not be able to maintain a conversation comfortably. You would be breathing more heavily. This would have a greater increase to the heart rate and your breath rate. Activities that would be characterized as vigorous would be higher intensity jogging, tennis, other ball sports, swimming, more intense bicycling. And then we have the muscle strengthening or resistance activities. So these would be activities that would increase skeletal muscle strength, power, endurance, and mass. And we will talk more about how these are characterized and defined. So you want to develop a plan for your physical activity. So you first develop a foundation or baseline, set a goal, and then develop a plan. Goal setting, establishing a routine would enhance your success. You want to choose a goal that is challenging but attainable. that it's measurable and could fit within your lifestyle reasonably. We have 3 types of activities that you would be separating your physical activity plan into, including aerobic exercise, strength or resistance training, and then including some flexibility training as well. We have what is called the FIT principle to develop or establish your physical activity plan, and you do that by including the frequency of exercise, the intensity, the time of your exercise sessions, and the type of exercise. So you include each of these components to a physical activity plan. We have the elements here broken down in a table, so the different types of activity would be aerobic activities, strength or resistance training, and then flexibility training. Aerobic fitness, it's recommended on most days of the week, so we have here elements of a well-rounded program would be 5 days per week of aerobic fitness, 20 to 60 minutes per day, and then resistance training 2 to 3 days per week, ideally not consecutive days, and it would be 1 to 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions of 8 to 10 different exercises, and then flexibility would be 2 to 3 days per week as well. And then there are examples of the types of activities that would be characterized within each category of aerobic, muscular, fitness or resistance training, and then flexibility. We see the definition of the aerobic fitness, muscle fitness, and flexibility as it relates to intensity. So we talked about it being characterized according to the ratings of perceived exertion. For aerobic fitness, that would be at least an RPE of 4, if not 4 or 5 or higher. This can also be characterized by MHR, percent of your age-dependent maximal heart rate, and so we'll talk about how that is defined. And so for aerobic fitness, that would be a percent of maximal heart rate between 55 to 85%. For aerobic fitness, for muscular fitness, it would be 40 to 80% of 1 rep max of your resistance training exercises. So with aerobic fitness, a further description of this, when we say aerobic or use the term aerobic, that means activities utilizing or with oxygen. You would use large muscle groups to optimize your increase in heart rate. So the larger the muscle group, the harder or more energy that would be required for that exercise to occur, which would then more greatly increase the heart rate for that given activity. ACSM, this stands for the American College of Sports Medicine, recommends 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, at least 5 days per week. This helps with strengthening the cardiovascular health and the strength of your heart and lungs. So this is where we will define the MHR, or the age-specific maximum heart rate. So if you haven't heard this term before, this is defined by or calculated by taking the number 220 and subtracting that by your age in years, and that would be your theoretical maximum heart rate. So for example, someone who is age 20 would take 220, subtract 20 from that, and so their maximum heart rate would be 200 beats per minute. So that obviously is very high. That's much higher than the resting heart rate. And so to get a goal heart rate for different levels of intensity of your physical activity, you would then take a percentage of that. So again, for someone who's 20 with their theoretical maximal heart rate of 200, a percent of maximal from 50 to 65% of the maximal heart rate would be 100 beats per minute to 130 beats per minute. So like if you were to take 50% of 200, that is 100 beats per minute. and up to maybe 65%, that would be 100 to 130 beats per minute. So that could be a goal for someone who is initially starting out with a physical activity program, who is not used to training. So they would start at the lower end of the range and then work up to a higher goal as they develop a base or foundation of their aerobic fitness. All right, so we have the other component being muscular fitness or resistance training. So components of this would be muscular strength, muscular endurance, and muscular power. So muscular strength is defined as the maximal force a muscle can exert against a load at one time. So if you would be characterizing this by your 1 rep max. So this would be the heaviest amount of weight that could be lifted for a given exercise against a load at one time. The endurance would be the ability of the muscle to perform repeated submaximal contractions over time without becoming fatigued. So the longer you can do a resistance exercise, the more repetitions, that would be a higher level of endurance. And then muscular power combines both strength with speed. So lifting a heavy weight quickly would be what would be represented by muscular power. So both a heavy weight over a quick amount of time. So that would be for explosive movements such as jumping or throwing. So with power introduces the component of speed. According to the American College of Sports Medicine, it's recommended to include muscle strengthening or resistance training to an exercise program 2 to 3, again, non-consecutive days per week. And then another important component of your program would be flexibility. So the more flexible your muscles are, the more elastic and ability, it would improve one's ability to do aerobic and muscular strength exercises. Being more flexible also reduces one's risk of injury. So being more flexible would both improve performance, help with balance and stability, and also reduce injury risk. We see that poor flexibility can be linked to chronic pain, and again, with improved flexibility, that helps with better balance, stability, reducing risk of falls, injuries, especially among older adults. It's very interesting that as we age, when we get older, our balance slowly will decline. And so if you're not actively working on improving flexibility and balance, then you can have a greater increased risk of falls as one becomes an older adult. ACSM recommends performing flexibility exercises at least 2 to 3 days per week. So based on all of these recommendations for aerobic training, resistance or strength training, and flexibility training, we see a sample fitness plan for an individual Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We see that there is 1 day of rest. We see, well, actually, I want you to just take a moment to look at this fitness plan and identify components of this plan that would match the recommendations that we just talked about. So you can pause this video, again, look at the plan and identify components that stand out and as they meet the recommendations that we just discussed. Okay, so I want to highlight some of the aspects of this program that would represent what we talked about. So you do see aerobic exercise integrated into the plan several days per week. So we have a spin class on Monday, a walking bout or a session on Tuesday, another spin class on Wednesday, walking again on Thursday, trail hiking on Saturday. So that is a form of aerobic activity on 5 days of the week. Some of the days would be more intense than others, so the spin class would be a higher intensity aerobic session as opposed to the walking. which would be on 3 days per week. That's a lower intensity aerobic activity. Next, we have resistance training on Tuesday. We have another resistance training on Thursday. So this would be 2 days of strength training, and these would be non-consecutive days for 30 minutes each. And then lastly, we see the integration of flexibility. So we have a stretching session on Monday, another stretching session on Wednesday, and then we see yoga on Friday, which is a component actually of both strength and flexibility together. So we see a lot of great aspects that are integrating our recommendations of including the 3 different types of activity: aerobic, strength, and flexibility, and also meeting the minute and intensity recommendations. It's important to plan for a proper warm-up and cool-down as part of your exercise routine. This is important at all levels. It helps to promote the elasticity of our muscles. It improves the blood flow of our system to improve the performance and reduce injury during an exercise session. So having a warm-up which promotes a gradual increase in heart rate, as well as a gradual decrease in heart rate after the exercise, as well as it promotes the warming up the muscles and promotes flexibility for the exercise session as well. We have the active body's use of fuels, and so we'll talk a little bit about the physiology of what's happening in the body while we're exercising, which allows us to then have the energy that we need to continue our muscle contraction and promote continued movement. So we have 2 interrelated energy producing systems. We have what is called aerobic metabolism requiring oxygen and anaerobic metabolism not requiring oxygen. Both of these energy producing systems will yield a product called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This ATP is needed for muscle contraction to occur. So that would be something needed for both aerobic exercise and strength exercise. We would have need for continued muscle contraction and the need for continuing production of ATP. Anaerobic metabolism promotes the synthesis of ATP immediately. It's very quick and it occurs for a quick high intensity activity. However, this is not something that can be sustained over long periods, so then we would have aerobic metabolism kicking in for more longer term aerobic type activities that would produce ATP through different metabolic pathways. For our energy producing systems, it largely requires energy that we get from the food that we consume, as well as water and oxygen. And the main macronutrients providing energy for these systems would be from carbohydrate and fat. So this is a diagram of the structure of ATP, again, adenosine triphosphate. We have the adenosine molecule and then 3 high energy phosphate molecules with high energy bonds that when broken or hydrolyzed would then produce energy. And we see that diagram. We have the need to convert ADP to ATP, and that's done with the energy that we consume from our food. And then with the hydrolysis or breakdown of ATP to ADP, we get the energy needed to do work, and a large component of that work would be, as it relates to exercise, muscle contraction. So for continued muscle contraction to occur, we need a continual supply of ATP. We do this through our energy system, so anaerobic metabolism would occur first at an initial onset of moderate to very high intensity exercise. We have the breakdown and utilization of phosphocreatine initially to produce ATP, and then we have the anaerobic breakdown of glucose through anaerobic glycolysis, which also is used to provide ATP. The utilization of phosphocreatine occurs initially after our very short supply of stored ATP is used up in about a second. Our stored ATP is used up very quickly. After that second, we will use phosphocreatine for the next 5 to 10 seconds to produce ATP, and then for the next 5 to 10 to up to about 30 to 60 seconds, we rely on anaerobic glycolysis. Phosphocreatine and its utilization produces 1 ATP per molecule of phosphocreatine. Anaerobic glycolysis produces 2 ATP per molecule of glucose, and that again is through anaerobic metabolism. Aerobic metabolism utilizes energy from carbohydrate and fat primarily, but also some energy from protein, and this is going to be utilizing oxygen. With the utilization of oxygen, we are able to produce more ATP than from anaerobic metabolism. So we saw with anaerobic metabolism, it is 1 ATP or 2 ATP per molecule of phosphocreatine or glucose. With aerobic metabolism, the ATP production will be much higher. You can see here through aerobic metabolism, we have the formation or the additional formation of ATP with glycolysis, with the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And this is allowed through the utilization of the macronutrients that we get from our food, or the substrate that we get from the food that we consume, either dietary protein, but primarily through dietary carbohydrate and fat. So when we consume the macronutrients, we get amino acids in the bloodstream, which can be broken down and used to produce ATP. When we consume carbohydrate, we get glucose in our blood, which can also be broken down through glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain to produce ATP. And then the dietary fat that we consume also will be broken down and utilized to produce ATP. You can see that each of our substrates, in addition to having a pathway where it can be broken down to produce ATP, has a pathway for anabolic processes. Amino acids can be used to build proteins, so this is a formation process which is anabolic, which would be building proteins, building tissue. With glucose and the carbohydrate substrate, we also have an anabolic process where glucose is stored as glycogen in the muscle or the liver. With the fatty acids coming from dietary fat, we also have an anabolic process where fat is stored in body cells. So there are different fates depending on our metabolic environment. Either our substrates can be used to produce ATP, such as during exercise, this would be prioritized. However, in other metabolic conditions, we can undergo anabolic or building or storage processes, either forming proteins, forming glycogen, or forming triglycerides to store fat. One other thing to point out is that dietary fat is going to be more energy producing per gram as compared to carbohydrate and protein. Dietary fat, we saw, has more than twice the amount of energy per gram, so 9 calories per gram versus 4 for carbohydrate and protein. So per fatty acid, you will be producing much more ATP as compared to carbohydrate and protein. So the fatty acids stored in adipose tissue, it's a depot of stored energy that can be used, and we saw that it supplies more than twice the amount of energy as compared to glucose and protein. Fat is going to be utilized for activities of low to moderate intensity and those activities of longer duration or endurance activities. Using protein for fuel, so protein, it's prioritized that protein be utilized to make proteins in the body. There's many important roles of proteins. There are structural proteins, contractile proteins, enzymes, hormones, antibodies, proteins involved in fluid balance, pH balance. So we want to use our proteins primarily for those functions. However, some protein can be broken down to produce ATP. So we see here that during rest or with low to moderate exercise, protein provides about 5% of our energy needs, so it can be broken down and used to form ATP, up to about 15% during endurance exercise. The branched chain amino acids, which are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. These amino acids will be taken up by the muscle more readily than other amino acids, and they would provide most of the energy supply during exercise. So the branched chain amino acids are used by the muscle more so than other amino acids. Resistance exercises uses protein for energy less than other types of exercise. For example, with endurance exercise, you would use more breakdown of protein to produce energy. The average diet would provide, especially within the US, we get plenty of protein and adequate amount of these amino acids. So most often supplementation is not needed for individuals to meet their protein needs. We see a further summary of aerobic versus anaerobic exercise. So with aerobic exercise, fat and carbohydrates are primarily utilized to produce energy in the form of ATP. With anaerobic exercise, we primarily utilize creatine phosphate, as we mentioned initially, but then carbohydrates largely in the form of glucose for anaerobic metabolism. So fat cannot be utilized as an energy source for anaerobic exercise, only in aerobic exercise. We see here in this figure that as the intensity of exercise increases, so with higher intensity exercise, we see the percentage of fuel use for our macronutrients. So if you take a look at this figure to try to decipher what it is representing, so if you want to pause and just look at this and try to understand for your own what this is representing. But I will also go over this. What is showing is that as the intensity of exercise increases, the percent of fuel use coming from carbohydrate will increase. So with the highest intensity of exercises, we are using near 80 to up to 90% of our fuel use coming from carbohydrate. So higher intensity exercises will use more glucose, more forms of carbohydrate to produce ATP. And then alternatively, lower intensity exercises will be utilizing more fat. Protein will be pretty consistent among the intensity of exercise. And then, so this is addressing intensity of exercise. In this slide, we address duration. So initially, we rely more so on forms of carbohydrate, so glucose coming from the blood or from the diet, or glucose coming from the breakdown of glycogen will be used initially in exercise. After 20 minutes, up to 40 to 60 minutes, we have lower utilization of forms of carbohydrate. As we start using up our carbohydrate, we begin to use more dietary fat. What's interesting is that our ability to continue exercise relies on our supply of glycogen. So we will start using more and more fat to spare glycogen, because once we run out of glycogen, that's when we hit the wall and basically reach our end in terms of our ability to continue continue endurance activity or exercise. So that would be bonking or hitting the wall is when we run out of our glycogen. So this outlines the effect of training, the adaptations that occur with more of our training status. So as we train more, our body adapts to that training and we increase our aerobic fitness. So this is an outline of what happens as we train more and become more fit or more trained. So overall, training increases the ability to convert the energy from our food to ATP, our energy from carbohydrates, fatty acids, and amino acids to ATP, or the body's workable form of energy. So someone who is more trained has improved insulin sensitivity, which means that basically the insulin binding to the insulin receptor will then promote the entry of glucose into the cells, especially the muscle and the adipose cell. Someone who is more trained has a increased ability to store glycogen. So if you're more trained, you can actually store more glycogen. Someone who's more trained has a higher amount of muscle triglycerides. So triglyceride storage within the muscle. That is because it is more favorable to utilize lipids at moderate to high intensity exercise to help to spare glycogen. So someone who is more trained has more triglycerides available locally within the muscle and has a better ability to utilize fat or lipid at moderate to higher intensity exercise. Someone who is more trained has more mitochondria. Mitochondrial support aerobic metabolism. Someone who is more trained has a better efficiency of their cardiovascular and respiratory systems. And someone who's more trained has an increased vascularization of muscle tissue. And this essentially means that there is what's called a higher capillary density, greater amount of blood flow. And you know, with blood, we have red blood cells which carry oxygen. So basically, with better vascularization, we have a higher and more efficient delivery of oxygen to our muscles. So fascinating, the adaptations that our body will make in response to training to improve our ability to perform and train at an even higher level. Okay, so we'll go over diet for exercise and the macronutrients, what is recommended. So carbohydrate, we see, is a primary fuel for many types of activities. Carbohydrates are used for higher intensity activities. We saw as intensity of exercise increases, the percent reliance on carbohydrate for fuel will also increase. We see that carbohydrate is also used initially with more as a more dominant fuel in the early portions of exercise. So it is very important. It's readily utilized and available in anaerobic and aerobic metabolism. So it's recommended to consume about 60% of total calories from carbohydrate, and that would equate to at least 6 grams per kilogram of body weight. So for someone, for example, who is 60 kilograms, that would be 60 kilograms times 6 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram. So that would equate to 360 grams of carbohydrate per day. Someone who is exercising for a higher volume, more training would be someone who is an endurance athlete, for example. They would be in training for a longer duration on almost every day per week, so their carbohydrate needs would be much higher at a level of about 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So that same individual who is 60 kilograms, that could equate to up to 5 to 600 grams of carbohydrate per day. That's a lot of carbohydrates. However, for an athlete at that level who is training at that level, it would be very important for them to get that amount. But just compare that amount of carbohydrates, 5 to 600 grams per day, to the amount of carbohydrates that you are consuming when you look at your diet analysis. You see maybe you would be consuming 250, maybe 300 grams of carbohydrate per day is what we typically see. So that's about double what someone would be typically eating. So it's very important for an athlete at that level to really plan and prepare snacks and meals to be getting their required amount of carbohydrate all throughout the day. Fat is also an important fuel source, so it's recommended from 20 to 35% of total calories be from fat. Less than 20% intake of fat of our total calories is associated with reduction in performance, energy, health. So it would be important to get between 20 to 35% of our total calories from fat. The fat that you do consume, it's important that it is nutrient rich, coming from monounsaturated fats, so nuts, avocados, oils, also the essential fats such as coming from fish oil, so it would be the omega-3 and the omega-6 fatty acids, with omega-3 rich sources being fish oil. Also, flaxseed, walnuts would be containing omega-3 fatty acids, and then you would want to limit saturated fat and trans fat. We have protein, so the RDA minimum would be 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. In the US, we definitely meet, if not well exceed, the RDA. For athletes or those who would be exercising regularly, individuals would need, on average, about 1.2 to 1.7 grams per kilogram per day. But again, even with this higher level, needs are typically and easily met on a normal balanced diet. So often protein supplements are not necessary, and protein intakes beyond this have not been shown to be beneficial, and could even be unhealthy if excessive intakes would be beyond 2 grams per kilogram per day. That could be overly taxing on the kidneys potentially. For strength and resistance, a recommendation would be to consume up to 0.18 grams of protein per pound of body weight within 4 hours of training to optimize muscle growth. So this would be like a post-exercise protein recommendation of making sure to get high quality protein, so protein coming from high quality, very bioavailable sources containing all of the essential amino acids. Here's a table, and there are 2 slides with kind of summaries of recommendations. So again, the recommendations would be between 1.2 to 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, slightly lower for endurance athletes, but you can see the amount that would be recommended even at the highest level would be within the range of the US average intake. And again, you would see that here with a further breakdown of recommendations for example, moderate versus elite athletes, athletes in power sports, resistance athletes, but again, the recommendation would not go beyond 1.7 grams per kilogram, and for an average 70 kilogram male, which is 154 pounds, again, the recommended intakes would be well within what would be reasonable and already consumed largely in someone following a typical diet in the US. For vitamins and minerals, there are no actual separate recommended dietary allowance levels for athletes, so there's not a separate RDA category for athletes or elite athletes. So it's recommended that athletes follow what's recommended through the RDA based on their sex and life stage. So, but some research indicates potentially higher needs for some micronutrients, namely micronutrients involved in bone health, such as calcium and vitamin D, micronutrients involved in the delivery of oxygen to our cells, which would be iron. The antioxidant nutrients may also be needed at higher levels for some athletes. Also, those vitamins involved in energy metabolism, such as the B vitamins, as we talked about, and also sodium, because we see that sodium is lost in the sweat. So athletes with excessive levels of sweat, salty sweaters, they may have higher needs potentially of sodium as well. Athletes tend to have higher intakes of calories just because they're expending, they're burning more energy. So with a higher intake of calories, especially with a well-balanced diet, they tend to consume higher amounts of vitamins and minerals. So recommendations currently state that just with higher intakes, that athletes would be consuming higher amounts of vitamins and minerals anyway. So they should be meeting their RDA level, even if their needs may be slightly higher than a sedentary individual or a moderately active individual. The exception would be for athletes potentially restricting calories or where they feel a pressure to be at lower body weight or body fat level. So any athlete that would be restricting calories, which is not recommended, but if that were to occur, they may be more at risk for not getting their recommended essential vitamins and minerals. Vegetarian athletes or vegan athletes, especially strict vegans, would be at higher risk for under-consuming certain vitamins and minerals. And so in that case, fortified foods or a multivitamin, multi-mineral supplement may be recommended. Iron deficiency is a key nutrient of concern. So iron deficiency anemia would have and does have significant effects to overall health and then performance. We have the functions of iron, as we talked about, being involved in transporting oxygen. It is a cofactor in the electron transport chain, which is involved in ATP synthesis. So we see a consequence of iron deficiency being weakness, fatigue, and decreased work capacity. So one, iron deficiency anemia would affect these processes, affect health, but then in turn would also affect performance. So to prevent, it's important to focus on iron-rich foods. Unless medically supervised, it's not recommended for supplementation. But athletes are often, especially collegiate athletes, are checked for their iron status, iron levels. So if deficiency occurs, then through medical supervision, they are provided with supplementation and then rechecked for their iron levels. Fluid replacement, so with athletes, especially athletes who are exercising in warm climates, athletes that are exercising indoors where there's not a lot of circulation of air or air conditioning, or those athletes wearing heavy clothing such as football, lacrosse, that they would be more at risk for excessive fluid loss. Thirst is often not a reliable indicator of fluid needs for athletes. Oftentimes, thirst may occur even after dehydration begins to set in. So markers or other methods of evaluating hydration status could be to evaluate urine color. So the urine color is ideally to indicate adequate hydration should be the color of light lemonade. So anything darker than lemonade could indicate the initial onset of dehydration. If the urine is the color of like apple juice, like a darker yellow, that would absolutely indicate dehydration and need for further fluids. You also don't want urine to be clear. A urine color that is completely clear like water is indicating a risk of overhydration. So a light lemonade color is ideal to indicate euhydration, so not being overhydrated or dehydrated. We have a summary of general guidelines here for fluid replacement. So before, during, and after, we would want to have 5 to 7 milliliters per kilogram of body weight at least 4 hours before. For events lasting longer than 30 or 30 to 60 minutes, you would want to have 1.5 to 3.5 cups per hour on average, and then after exercise, you would want to consume 2 to 3 cups of fluid for every pound lost. So these are general guidelines. We also have our general guidelines for daily intake. So we talked about the needs for men and women being 13 cups per day for men, 9 cups per day for women. So the overall needs for athletes are going to be even higher than this. You want to avoid losing more than 2% of your body weight during exercise. And so sports dietitians will actually do assessments of athletes where they will weigh them before exercise and after exercise and account for any fluid intake during exercise to see how much weight was lost as fluid, and from there you can calculate the sweat rate. So you can check your fluid loss to indicate the fluid needs, the amount of fluid that you would need to consume to prevent dehydration. This is important because even a level of dehydration of 2 to 3%, 2 to 3% of body weight loss from fluid can affect performance. Okay, so we have our sports drinks. Sports drinks are different from water. As compared to water, they will contain more carbohydrate. They also will contain more sodium and potassium. So sports drinks are designed to contain a lot of what we would be losing in our sweat as it relates to our electrolytes. We see the sodium and potassium levels here. But what's nice is it also contains carbohydrate, so it will help to replenish the energy lost from glucose from our glycogen stores. So with consuming fluid drinks, we get not only the fluid, we also get carbohydrate that we would be losing from our glycogen or our blood glucose, and we also get electrolytes. So the sports drinks help to maintain blood glucose level, delay the bonking effect, so it helps to reduce depletion of muscle glycogen. It will supply electrolytes lost from sweat. So for exercises less than 60 minutes, it's not recommended to have sports drinks during exercise. It's not needed. Just fluid consumed as water would be recommended, but for beyond 60 minutes, the sports drinks are helpful with these for these reasons, to help maintain blood glucose, supply and replenish electrolytes, and spare muscle glycogen. We have the breakdown of caffeine, energy, and sugars in different sports drinks. So having beverages that are too high in caffeine may be detrimental, so you want to avoid intakes of caffeine that are too high, especially some people are more sensitive to caffeine than others. We see the amount of sugar contained in a number of these sports drinks, so especially if these are being consumed outside of the context of exercise, that would not be recommended due to the added sugars. All right, we see the pre-endurance event meal, so recommendations for before, and then during, and then we'll talk about after exercise. But before exercise, again, this would be 2 to 4 hours prior. You want to have a light meal to make sure that you are not going into exercise hungry, low in energy. The meal, though, should be consisting primarily of carbohydrate. This is because carbohydrate is more easily and readily utilized for energy. You want to have the meal be low in fat and little fiber, because if you have a meal that is higher in fat or higher in fiber, that can lead to bloating, gas, and it can promote the food staying in the stomach, so it can slow gastric emptying. So if you have a higher fat meal or a higher fiber meal, that meal will stay in the stomach longer, not pass into the small intestine and be absorbed and utilized, which that would be uncomfortable if you have the food remaining in your stomach. Moderate protein. Again, you would want to avoid fatty and fried foods. For meals that would be closer to the time of exercise, 1 to 2 hours prior, you would recommend something that would be blended or liquid meal, something that would be even more easily digested and absorbed. We have some examples here, so breakfast or lunch or a dinner. So we see here a breakfast idea: Cheerios, milk, this would be reduced fat milk, a small muffin with orange juice, 450 calories, and 92 grams of carbohydrate. You see that this meal is 82% carbohydrates. You see it's primarily carbohydrate, lower in fat with the reduced fat milk, for example. So this is going to be digested, absorbed, and utilized readily for exercise. We see another example: yogurt, a half a bagel, apple juice, 1 tablespoon of peanut butter. This is also going to be close to 70% carbohydrate and providing adequate carbohydrate with lower amounts of fat, moderate protein, and would be more easily, again, digested and absorbed and utilized for exercise. We see other examples of meals for lunch or dinner. So we have a pork chop, and this would be a small amount, so 3 ounces. 3 ounces is about the size of the palm of your hand, or a small cell phone would be about 3 ounces. You would see 1.5 cups of rice, some vegetables, a cup of chocolate milk, and Jello. So this is a higher calorie meal, but still at 60% carbohydrate. And then another spaghetti noodle sauce, reduced fat milk, and green beans. So also providing higher carbohydrate proportionally, lower in fat, and moderate in protein. Okay, fueling during an event. So this would only be necessary for exercise bouts, so continuous exercise longer than 60 minutes. If you go to the gym and you're there for less than 60 minutes, or if you're doing a lot of activity where you're starting but then resting for a lot and then starting again, fueling during a session is not needed. This is for continuous exercise activity for 60 minutes or longer. So if you have a longer continuous bout of exercise, it is recommended to have 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. This allows for a maintenance of blood glucose and reduces the rate at which you are depleting glycogen. It can be beneficial to have the carbohydrate coming from varied sources to increase carbohydrate availability. So carbohydrate coming from glucose, fructose, and maltodextrin. Products containing smaller amounts of amino acids may also provide benefit. All right, so now we see recommendations for strength and power athletes, strategies for enhancing muscle gain. So when we think about diet and nutrition for promoting building muscle and gaining muscle, what do we think about? Oftentimes we think about what macronutrient I would say protein, right? So oftentimes when people want to build muscle, they are thinking, okay, I need to really increase the amount of protein that I need or that I'm consuming. But based on the typical US diet, and as we saw with the recommendations, most individuals are getting adequate protein. And what is very important for building muscle, building tissue, is getting adequate calories. So we want to, if we are going to be building muscle, you want to, one, get an overload of stress to the muscle through appropriate exercises that would promote muscle building. But you also need an increase in calories. You need to have the calories needed to build tissue paired with the adequate amount of protein. So in an appropriate overload with the right intensity and amount of resistance training, and then adequate calories paired with adequate protein. These are all what are going to be needed to enhance gains in muscle and increase muscle protein synthesis. It is important, however, to make sure that the protein that is consumed is not occurring all at just 1 or 2 times during the day. We best utilize the protein that we consume if we get it in smaller amounts more frequently during the day. So we can best use protein when consumed in amounts of about 20 to 30 grams at a time. So if our needs for protein for the day are 100 grams or 120 grams, you want to break that up into 5 times that you're getting 20 grams of protein versus 2 times you're getting 50 grams at a time. So that helps with having a constant supply of amino acids in the blood, breaking up the protein all throughout the day. You may need some extra protein during recovery after a resistance training session, but again, you would not need necessarily more than 20 to 30 grams at that time. Okay, needs before and during strength training. You want to get adequate carbohydrate, hydration. Creatine supplementation may be an option. However, if you're taking a supplement, you want to ensure that that supplement is safe and effective. Just like with endurance, we would want to have a fat intake be about 20 to 35% of total calories. So we have the needs of our recommendations after exercise to post-exercise. We see that having 20 grams of high quality protein 1 to 2 hours after exercise. Also carbohydrates at the level of about 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. So we see some sample recovery meals. We see them providing sources of carbohydrate, also protein coming from turkey, the cheese, and the milk. And you can see that this is going to supply 71 grams of carbohydrate, about 30 grams of protein, and 10 grams of fat. So we wouldn't want to have amount of fat that's too high, because that would slow the entry of the other macronutrients into from the small intestine into the blood. So we would want to have higher carbohydrate, no more than 30 grams of protein, so again between 20 and 30 grams, and then about 10 grams of fat or less. We see another option being yogurt with a banana, supplying 86 grams of carbohydrate, again about 30 grams of protein and 80 grams of fat. And then we would have the last option being a ready-to-drink Gatorade recovery beverage, a shake consisting of 65 grams of carbohydrate, again about 30 grams of protein, and then only 1.5 grams of fat. So these would be sample recovery meals providing recommended amounts of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Okay, so we're going to wrap up talking about supplements and athletic performance. So ergogenic aids are a substance or treatment intended to directly improve exercise performance. So a significant portion of what would be considered an ergogenic aid would be dietary supplements. So it's a very popular market, providing in 2011, we see $3.6 million spent on sports nutrition supplements. So proven ergogenic aids, so those that are seen as safe and effective, are those either promoting adequate hydration, electrolytes, carbohydrates, and kind of balanced intake of macronutrients as recommended by MyPlate. Athletes actually can easily meet protein needs from food, so supplementation of proteins are not typically necessary. Dietary supplements should only be used to meet any shortcomings of the diet. So you want to have a food first approach and aim to get your required intake of macro and micronutrients from food. There are risks associated with intake of dietary supplements. So if a product is categorized as a dietary supplement, it is actually not well regulated by the FDA. Regulation of that product does not occur until after that product enters the market, and so it can only be banned by the FDA only after there have been a number of negative adverse health effects to individuals. There are some organizations that will test and evaluate dietary supplements, especially test dietary supplements for the presence of banned substances for collegiate athletes, for example. There is an organization called the National Sanitation Foundation, the NSF, and they will actually test dietary supplements, and they keep an up-to-date list called NSF Certified for Sport, and whatever supplements are included on the list are, when doing chemical analysis and testing, are shown to not contain banned substances. So there are certain safeguards that can be taken by athletes to reduce their risks associated with taking dietary supplements. However, it is very important for individuals in general and for elite athletes, collegiate athletes, competitive athletes to know the risks associated with supplement use and to have the food first approach to getting adequate nutrition. Okay, so with that, we end our discussion of nutrition for health and activity, and I do recommend that you continue to review the content from the chapter as you prepare for the module quiz.